Beautiful. It is so good to be here. I'm so glad that we can make it before this so-called apocalyptic snowstorm that's coming for us this weekend. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we're here now. The sun is shining. We are here to celebrate a great man and his work. My name is Robert Trent Vincent. I have the great honor of being the director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. I'm in a line with Dr. Butler. I am indebted to Dr. Butler and his leadership, and I will explain more in the introduction. We are so happy to celebrate this man and his work, his scholarship, his institution building, his humanity as a father, as a partner, as a mentor, as a teacher, as a collaborator. We are honored to recognize Dr. Reginald Butler, who was born in 1944 in Philadelphia, where he was primarily raised, but also spent many summers in Goochland County, Virginia, right down the road, down 64. Dr. Butler graduated with a BA from Western Washington University in 1969 and earned a master's degree and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Took the PhD in 1989. And there he wrote his pioneering dissertation, Evolution of a Rural Free Black Community, Goochland County, Virginia, 1728 to 1832. And that is the basis of this wonderful book that we are celebrating today. Dr. Butler arrived at the University of Virginia in 1991, where he arrived as an assistant professor of history. After the sudden, shocking passing of the Woodson Institute's founding director, Armstead Robinson, in 1995, Dr. Butler became the second director of the Woodson Institute, where he served with great distinction from 1996 to 2005. Dr. Reginald Butler was an extraordinary institution builder, and we'll hear about this throughout the day. He took the Woodson to new heights by securing several major external grants to support his multifaceted vision of Black study. And I emphasize Black study as opposed to Black studies. And there's a crucial distinction that I will elaborate on. His vision of Black study included and centered many community-based collaborations of local knowledge that included pioneering initiatives in digital humanities and deep archival research. That also included international programs in Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. Dr. Butler established and oversaw the Fourth Foundation funded Chesapeake Regional Scholars Summer Seminar, Rethinking African American Studies in the Digital Age. This was a collaboration with faculty at other institutions, particularly historically Black colleges and universities. He also oversaw and established the Center for the Study of Local Knowledge. This included workshops and seminars that advanced the research and teaching in Black studies, pointing to new directions in the field. In tandem with the Virginia Center for the Digital Humanities, for Digital History, Dr. Butler also established and oversaw the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities funded project, Race in Place, an African American community in the Jim Crow South. And this is documenting Jim Crow in Charlottesville and how African Americans lived and navigated those worlds. At that program's inauguration, Dr. Butler was quoted explaining what he hoped to achieve with that project. And I'm quoting. First, he said, the project introduces African American undergraduates to the rigors and rewards of historical research. Second, it builds mutually beneficial relationships between the university and local African American communities. Finally, he said, the project incorporates new technologies through partnerships with the university's Center for Digital History, the Digital Media Lab, and the Special Collections Digital Center. In these ways, Dr. Butler worked closely with UVA faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, staff, local community members to do this work, including the important archaeological research that led to the Catherine Kitty Foster Memorial on the South Lawn near what is now in Gibson Halls. Dr. Butler also championed undergraduate recruitment and mentoring through the Emerging Scholars Program, introducing students to academic community engagement. And with another Ford Foundation grant, the Woodson-sponsored Africa and African diaspora-focused UVA J-Term and summer study abroad programs and courses in Cuba, Brazil, and Ghana. Cheryl Hicks, a former UVA student and a Woodson postdoctoral fellow, and a professor herself, spoke to the impact of Dr. Butler's programs on her own intellectual formation. And I'm quoting her. Dr. Butler played such a critical role in my development as a scholar from my undergraduate years as a history major to being a postdoctoral fellow at the Woodson. I will never forget his mentorship. While he will be missed, he touched so many lives, especially students, and thus he will never be forgotten. Dr. Hicks shared those words in the aftermath of Dr. Butler's passing in 2019. But Dr. Butler was so much more than an academic. He was a man who lived a full life as a civil rights activist, as a man who desegregated labor unions, as a man who worked as an iron worker on the Baltimore docks, as a logger in the Pacific Northwest, as a fisherman on salmon fishing boats. He was a partner to Gertrude Fraser and a loving, dedicated father. Among others. I left it to you to make that interjection. A loving, dedicated father of 4 children, Ishmael, Omar, Alfred, and Maya. Because of these diverse lived experiences, Reginald could move easily in and out of university spaces. He could do that to engage meaningfully with everyday people in everyday life. In this way, he embodies a model of Black study. We have Black studies that's been institutionalized in universities, in departments, in programs. And quite often, one can think about Black studies, wrongly in my view, as just one more professional enterprise. It's just one more academic discipline. Just one more academic unit in a larger university with many academic units. But we know that there's a much longer trajectory and genealogy of Black study, of Black people drawn from our own histories, our own epistemologies, our own cultures, our own ways of being. And that does not require a PhD. It requires the lived experience and the memory and the ability to remember those histories and those cultures and those traditions and those ways of being. That's a much longer and much more expansive tradition. That tradition of Black study is what Reginald Butler was all about. So even as he was in the university, he was not so much of the university, but of the larger Black community. And all of these projects, all of these initiatives, all of this work represents that in practice. That is Reginald Butler, embodying a model of Black study that welcomed community members, lay scholars as co-producers of knowledge, of co-archivists, of co-disseminators of knowledge. I will close by sharing what Reginald Butler meant to me directly. In 1998, I was finishing my own dissertation from Howard University. I had funding. I could have stayed at Howard to write and finish there. But I had heard about the Woodson. I knew about the Fellows Program. And I knew something about this man named Reginald Butler. And I sent an email to him to say, look, you don't know me, but I'm finishing my dissertation, and I would love to be part of the community at the Woodson. I didn't expect a reply. Big people, you don't expect much, you know. He replied immediately, coming. And he treated me like the actual fellows who had applied and had earned their place here. Set me up with the carol and said, welcome, how can we help? That academic year, 1998-1999, was transformative for me, not just academically, not just intellectually, but holistically as a person, because I saw firsthand the model of Black study that was inclusive and welcoming, and said, you have a place at this table. And that is a model of Black study that I've carried with me everywhere I've been. And it's a model that I've sought to replicate in the tradition of Armstead Robinson, of Reginald Butler, of Deborah McDowell. That tradition of Black study that makes the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies a unique, special place to be, to engage in the deep work of Black study. For that, we owe Dr. Reginald Butler. Without further ado, it is time to begin our program and to hear from the scholars who took the pioneering dissertation and created the manuscript that Dr. Butler, because of his sacrifice, because of his dedication to the larger mission of Black study, never finished in his lifetime. And so we transition from this introduction as a beginning point to a full day of celebrating Dr. Butler, to our first panel of scholars, Peter Onuf, Josh Rothman, Bob Vernon, Scott French, who served as Associate Director with Reginald, and Nadine Zimmerly, editor of UVA Press, who did so much to bring this book to life. Without further ado, this panel will begin to discuss the journey of this book from dissertation into book. Thank you so much for listening. Let's begin the celebration of Dr. Reginald.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here today to talk about Reginald, an old colleague of mine and friend, and to have been part of this project which fulfilled Reginald's old ambition as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins to write a great book about a place he deeply came from and cared about. We'll hear a little bit later the genesis of this particular volume that's come out, so belated, and I can say that with particular emphasis because I was the chair of the department when Reginald came up for tenure, and it was this original dissertation which we presented to the dean, and he had a contract with another press, and as you know, it didn't get finished. And the big story is that he gave of himself, of his personal agenda, and it was a deeply personal agenda. I think one of the reasons he didn't finish it was he cared so much about it. It was so important to him. It was never good enough. And we don't claim to have made it good enough in Reginald's terms, but it's way good for us. And it has been a kind of journey for us, as Robert suggests, to make it come to fruition with the great support of the university press. We have fulfilled a promise Reginald made to us, and I feel enormous satisfaction to come to closure on this. I'm nearly dead, but it's out. I want to say, I don't know, my students get on my case because I keep waving my dead hands and saying goodbye to them. But I'm still alive, and what keeps me alive is the love of the scholarship that we do. It's incredibly important. It's personal to me too, but I want to talk a little bit about the broader themes of the book and its extraordinary value to us today. At a moment, we're thinking about community a lot. We're thinking about connections, about the way we can do things together. Scholarship is really important in this broader context. And what we're going to do, and what the book does, is demonstrate Reginald's dedication to the communities. We're talking about Black studies in the plural, about the broader communities to which we all belong. Their differences, their commonalities, their future. And that idea of a community is itself a profoundly important in Black studies and has produced much brilliant scholarship. But Reginald's understanding of community, forged under the most adverse circumstances, forged in a world that was dominated by white people in Virginia, where there was little space between the masters and the enslaved for anybody else, in a legal limbo. The challenges were extraordinary, and what Reginald lovingly chronicles are the ways that his subjects, people he identified with, were able to live lives with dignity. It's in some ways a very inspiring story. It's also inspiring that Reginald had the dedication to find that community, because it doesn't have the usual marks of a community. It doesn't even have the space of a plantation or plantations where some kind of autonomous culture among the enslaved might flourish. Because it's precisely on the boundaries that this community was formed. It was divided against itself by definition, because without the patronage, without the apprenticeships, without the ways in which Black people were exploited, there would have been no community. It was a hard-fought community on the frontier, on a contested frontier. Well, we'll hear more about it from Josh in just a minute. I want to give you a sense, though, of our journey and the kind of community we formed to fulfill the promise of this book. And I want to say, first of all, you'll find Reginald's wonderful book is now in the context of essays by my excellent colleagues. This book needs to be read now. It's important, and what Reginald had to say in the 1980s and early 1990s should be heard now. Now, Bob Vernon, who's an extraordinary character, sitting right in the middle where he belongs, it's all his fault. And he's going to explain the origin story of this book in just a few minutes. But what we'd like to do is give you an introduction to what the book does and how it helps us think about Reginald's career, but also the point very importantly made. This was a very, very personal enterprise for him. Not with that loud confessional, look at me. This was with deep modesty, with reverence for the materials that were so hard to find in the Goochland County courthouse. You'll hear more about the evidence from Bob in just a minute. What we sought to do in this publication was to provide the framework within which this book can live. And playing an essential role was Josh Rothman, who is a distinguished historian of the South. He tells me he wants to end up being, what, a university president? What are your ambitions? No. He's going over to administration. But we can say the same thing about Reginald, of course, who went over to administration. Right. That was a fast
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Talk about front lines and frontiers. Being in high administration and fighting for the very existence of the university. Important work, folks. It's all important. But Josh gives us a sense of where the literature was when Reginald was writing his dissertation. I have to point out that Reginald and I have the same dissertation director at Johns Hopkins, Jack P. Green, 94 years old. Yeah, every month I take a pilgrimage. I live in Connecticut, to Rhode Island. You say that's not very far, is it? It's still a pilgrimage to visit my mentor. I'm getting to be pretty softly and sentimental in my old age. I'm even beginning to identify with, I shouldn't say this here, but with Thomas Jefferson. But Josh gives us an historiographical framework. Where was the world of scholarship in the field that Reginald was working on when he started writing, and what's happened since? And so he situates the book. And then we have, as I've already introduced Bob, the very tall guy in the middle, who's a deep researcher, and all these people are going to speak for themselves momentarily, but he's a devoted student of Reginald's, whose work has been invaluable for researchers in this area, and for giving us and giving you, the readers of this book, a sense of what's available now, what evidence is out there. Many of us have found that when we were young, research meant going to archives and digging deep and spending years. Now you can do a lot of things more quickly, thanks to people like Bob, who's digitizing stuff, who's organizing access to materials that were hard to find in the old days. We can't overemphasize this. There has been no better time in my history, in our history, to do history, even though there aren't going to be very many historians in the future. This is the best and worst of times. But where would we be without the deep research and the evidence? And Bob will help you see what Reginald couldn't see, or could see partially, which makes his achievement all the more remarkable. And then another person who's a devoted friend and colleague of Reginald's is Scot French, who helped run the Woodson Center and has intimate familiarity with grant writing. This is where it really happens. You think grants are, well, they are an onerous task, but they are a very meaningful one. In some ways, the book that Reginald didn't complete was superseded by the grant proposals he did write. And Scot has read them, has called on his own experience to give us a portrait of how Reginald continued to do history as an administrator. Seems like a contradiction in terms, but do you actually do history? No, just joking. Of course, this is the future. It's like, there's not a distinction. We have new respect for administrators, so go do it, Josh.
I never should have told you what I'm doing.
I just learned all this stuff. I don't know, I can't help but share it with you. Finally, none of this work, and I wanted to say the last, this may be just a literary conceit, but I really mean it. We formed a little community, sort of mirroring the community that Reginald's community and the community that he was reading about. So that's my big researching. That's my big theme. But we could be a community and talk to each other for the end of time, because the things that we talk about when we talk about Reginald's book are endlessly interesting without Nadine Zimmerly and the press. And she's not an ordinary editor. She gets in and edits, and she cares. And she's produced a book that if you don't have it yet, you should buy several copies each. That it is a proud production of the press. I am thrilled to be connected with it. This whole project has been extraordinarily gratifying to me personally, and I'm very happy to be here today. And now, enough blather from me. They get their chance to correct my errors, and you want to talk about the life and administration, go ahead, Josh.
I don't. Well, now I get to blather. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Robert, and to the Woodson for bringing all this together. It's just really, it's a little mind-blowing for me, honestly. I was talking to Scott yesterday. I've been back to Charlottesville many, many times since graduate school, but I don't remember the last time I was in this building. But it looks very similar to the way it did in the 90s, which, you know, I'm sure there are faculty members in here who said, yeah, that's the problem. You know, I think the first class I ever TA'd was in this room. The first lecture class I ever taught was in this room. And I spent a lot of time in the offices and the lobby of this room.
Waiting for coffee.
No, I wasn't waiting for coffee. I was often waiting for Reginald. Yeah, you know, I worked with Reginald a little bit in probably I was trying to remember what year it was. It must have been 97, 98. And he asked me to do, he threw a little money at me, and he asked me to get involved in the Race and Place project. And he sent me downtown to the Historical Society. And I remember I spent, God, I can't believe I actually did this given how quickly somebody else could do it now. But in the 90s, you know, I went through, I was creating sort of databases out of the city directories. This was part of the sort of Jim Crow, Albemarle County, and sort of extracting kind of names of Black people and Black businesses to try to build sort of not only something searchable, but that neighborhoods could be modeled, that kind of thing. You know, I wrote a couple essays on the source material that was available. And I remember sitting down with Reginald after that, and I don't even know how to describe this meeting, because I felt like I had disappointed him. I did. But I could also tell he was kind of messing with me. You know, he had that sort of like, that straight deadpan, but also that kind of glint in his eye. And as a graduate student, I didn't know what to do with that, right? I came out of that meeting just feeling terrible, like, oh man, he wanted so much more. I wasn't sure what more looked like. But you know, with hindsight, I thought when we were talking about preparing for this, I thought a lot about sort of my interactions with Reginald. And I think that as a grad student, I couldn't appreciate what he was driving at and what he wanted the way I can now as a faculty member after like 25 years of being in the field, which is, you know, he expected more. He had high expectations, and he thought I could carry them out. I do think that he liked the work. Ultimately, I think he was happy with what I gave him, but I, you know, I had an enormous, like, boundless respect for Reginald. You know, I felt like, you know, the demands he had, I mean, in some ways were kind of the demands he also put on himself, right? He didn't ask you to do anything that he wouldn't have asked of himself, right? He had high standards, he expected you to meet them, and he thought you could pull them off, or he wouldn't ask you to do it in the first place. And, you know, from the perspective of not a graduate student anymore, that was really, really a remarkable thing. And the truth is, Reginald's influence on me was sort of, you know, a little bit direct, but almost kind of indirect, but as profound, because in his being kind of a founding member of the Central Virginia Social History Project, that was really in a lot of ways sort of the incubator of the very earliest ideas I had for what became my dissertation and then my first book. And a lot of the ways of thinking about, you know, communities of people of color, and by that meant it could be enslaved people, it could be free people, often pulling in white people of various sorts, like the way those communities constituted themselves, the way those various groups of people interacted with one another. The imprint of Reginald's thinking on that is sort of everywhere in my first book. And again, something I don't think I realized until much, much later. And, you know, I think I'm thrilled to be involved in this project. When Peter reached out to me, I did have a moment where I was like, are you sure I'm the right person to do this? You know, I had always known about Reginald's dissertation. I did read it, you know, back when I was working on my dissertation, but I never knew what became of it. I was really thrilled to be asked, honored to be asked. And of course I said I would do it, but I did definitely question myself whether I could sort of live up to the task of doing it. And I think in rereading it, you know, in the last few years, I think there are a bunch of things that sort of stood out to me as still pretty remarkable about the book. One is that it was really fresh and cutting edge for what it was in the 1980s, right? I mean, this was sort of a entirely new conceptualization of free black people in the South, right? I mean, he's writing sort of in the wake of the kind of Ira Berlin sort of slaves without masters sort of vibe, which Berlin didn't mean in a pejorative way, but that was sort of how he saw the position of free black people, right? That they were essentially in this sort of neo-enslaved status, even though they were technically free. And Reginald's like, no, that's not what this looks like. That's not what their communities looks like. That's not what their own self-perception looked like. You know, he had whole other ideas about thinking of what community meant, the relationship of people to the law, to white people, to each other, to the regime they lived under, in ways that could be sort of ironic, could be kind of paradoxical. And that depended really not just on those big oppressive structures, but on those very local circumstances, right? A book like the one he was doing, it's important that it's grounded in a particular community, right? And these things might look broadly similar from community to community, but each community had its own specificities that were crucial to the ways that communities actually played out. And that idea, I think, remains totally fresh, right? I mean, 1989, right? So it's 37 years later. That's generations of scholarship later. And yet, this is still a lot of the ways that people write and think about free people of color and free black communities in the South. I mean, you know, there's that, you look in what's his name, Mel Ely's book, right? Israel and the Appomattox, which won the Bancroft Prize. I can't remember if it won a Pulitzer Prize too. Won all kinds of prizes. It's a great book, right? And, you know, if you look in the footnotes, which only a nerd would do, but trained professional nerd, right? In the footnotes, Mel has this bit where he says, you know, I came across the work of Reginald Butler when I was already well into writing this book. And it's like this footnote that's like an apology, because it's like, I know this reads a lot like Reginald's work, but I swear I didn't read it until later, right? I mean, that's sort of, there's something kind of prophetic in that, like he sort of predicted these models that were coming out. Now that book is a little bit old at this point, but I also think of somebody like Warren Miltier, right, who's a scholar who's probably the most prolific scholar of free black Southerners now. And the way, and I've read several of his books, and the way that he writes about free black people is still really, really familiar. Don't tell Warren this, I think maybe not quite as deep, but familiar, right? He writes about these relationships among all different kinds of people and different backgrounds in the South that were sort of intertwined and reciprocal and very fraught. He frames things in terms of the challenges of a clearly very racist legal system. But also there's all these contradictions and these loopholes, and the way that lived reality does not play out in accordance with the legal system and conditions on the ground. He writes about the ways that free people of color found to assert their independence and their freedom, and to really make not only materially significant, but psychologically really important gains for themselves and for their families. It took a lot of perseverance, took a lot of savvy, and circumstances were really challenging, and they could change on a dime, right? You think you have one relationship with somebody, you think people know you in the community, and like the laws maybe don't apply to you. Tomorrow you wake up, that could be different. And you don't know why, you don't know when, and you may not know it's coming. But that was the circumstances people lived in, and they made it work. And the ways that they made it work were really meaningful, right? The families they carved out, the communities they carved out, the socioeconomics networks they carved out. They're conflicted, they're complicated, they're both bounded and open at the same time. They're very fragile, but they're also really, really rich. And so those were sort of the ways I found that was just still kind of amazing how fresh this book felt, even though it had been written so long ago and it was unfinished, right? You could tell there was so much more that he wanted to do with the book that we couldn't have possibly done as interventions, right? I don't know if there were any notes that were left behind. I think it would have been a fool's errand to try, so I'm glad we didn't. I also think that what was interesting about the book is that there's all these sort of kind of potentialities in there. There's all these sort of like latent ideas and assumptions and theoretical considerations that aren't entirely fleshed out, but that I think are really interesting. And one of those is just the very conceptualization of, all right, what is a community? What does that mean? Does it require the sort of traditional structures of a community? Does it require sort of a specific place where it's bounded by something? And he's like, no, that's not. It's not necessarily what a community is. But I think there's a lot in this book that scholars could still dig into, right, and find really generative for their own work. And I sort of dug around, just kind of opening the book at random, reading pages here. Like I read it, but I'm reading pages here and there and trying to find sort of examples of this. And I just brought a couple, right? One, this is in the introduction where he says, it is in these quote unquote small places that the main questions about the nature of slavery and freedom, race and class will ultimately be answered. That's a bold statement. There's a lot in there, right? Is that true? Right? Is it true that the ultimate answers to the questions we have about race and place are going to be found, or race and class are going to be found in these small places? Not everybody's going to agree with that. He states that as a fact, right? This may be, well, not as a fact. This is a supposition, but I think something he would argue, right? This might be the answer. That's bold, right? I think people still can play a lot with that. Or, I found one later in the book where he's talking about the choices made by a man named Thomas Ford when he's writing his will. And he suggests that it's in sort of the crafting of the will of a man that nobody's ever heard of before, right? He says, but in the crafting of a will, not a diary, right? He thinks in the will, those are places where we might find the emergent values of a free black consciousness, right? And I think in the scholarly world, trying to get at that, the subjective understanding of free black people, of their place in the world, because there aren't a lot of diaries, right? And the ones that we have are from extremely unrepresentative free black people, frankly, right? We sometimes have the words of, people who were very wealthy, for example. Most free black people were not wealthy, right? They maybe can carve out some property. Maybe they have a business. Maybe they have a shop. Maybe they have nothing. But the idea that in an unknown free black man's will and the terms he used to craft it, that we might find in there black consciousness, that's like a really theoretically deep intervention. I think there's a lot of those sort of scattered throughout the book that I think are still sort of remarkable. And finally, I think the last thing, and I'll turn it over to Bob, is that deep engagement with the archive. Right? That's the other thing that really stands out. Finding people in those bits and pieces, the little fragments, you know, that even finding literally everything doesn't tell you about. I know you're trying to find literally everything. And look, and that was my introduction to doing history as a discipline. I can't tell you how many hours I've spent in courthouses, state archives, microfilm of people's will books and deed books and tax records and like really boring documents. But here's the thing about those documents, right? In and of themselves, they're dull as hell. But if you know what you're looking for and you know the people who produce those little bits of information, that's a story, right? That was the kind of stuff that sort of grew out of those kind of community studies of the 70s, but in the 70s they were doing it in the aggregate, right? So lots of charts and sort of like statistics drawn out of will books. I didn't care about any of that, right? You needed that, but I didn't want to put that in my book. I wanted to tell people stories, and it's digging into these bits and pieces of things in the archive that I think still produces some of the best work that we have. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Bob. He'll tell you a lot about that archive and what was there and what's there now.
Thanks. And a big thanks to Peter for taking this on when he didn't have to. This book would not have happened without the effort that Peter put into it. And he deserves to be recognized. I don't know how, but
You just did it.
We'll work it out at dinner.
okay, very good. So I guess in thinking about what I'm going to talk about, which is going to come off the top of my head, I thought a good place to start would be how we began this project. And it began with an email from Gertrude on the 4th of July in 2019 saying that Reginald was in the hospital and unconscious, and he passed the next day. The 7th of July was my mother's birthday, so immediately after that I took off to Halifax County to celebrate my mother's 92nd birthday. And when I came back, I sent a copy of Reginald's manuscript to Peter and to Scot, and I said, I've been sitting on this, I've been trying to get it out. Had tried to work with Reginald to get it out. Can this be published now? And Scot came back and he said that, well, it's the University of Illinois that has the contract for it, and I'm in no position to work on these sorts of details. Peter is, and he did an outstanding job of finally making the book happen. So that's where this comes from, but like with everything, there's a backstory. And the backstory for me goes back to about 1994 when I went to Richmond, Virginia Genealogical Society meeting, and I heard Helen Roundtree talk on Native Americans in Virginia. And this was of interest to me because my mother claimed Native American ancestry. And I wanted to know, okay, where are the documents for this? So I met with Helen and 3 other people for dinner, and we discussed all this. We talked about Plecker. She wanted to know, how do you know about Plecker? Everybody knows about Plecker now, but that wasn't something that was sort of in the air at the time. And she said that Native Americans are in the 3 black registers that each county kept. So I came on back to Albemarle, went over to the courthouse. Where's the 3 black register? Looked over here, looked over there. There was no register. What happened is that Albemarle recorded their registrations in the order books, and you had to page through the order books because they're poorly indexed, or no indexes at all, to find these. Then I began compiling a list of registrations, and at the same time, I was sort of contributing knowledge to the study of Catherine Foster's family and had found that 2 sons were dentured out. But the real thing, the thing that put me in contact with Reginald was when I found an entry that stated that a census, as it were, was to be taken in 1833. And the county commissioners were to go out and to make a list of all of the people of color that were free in the county, to say whether they were black or mulatto, was the term, that descriptive term, their age, their place of residence, how long they had been free, and their occupation. And I called over the history department, and the history department says, well, you want to talk to Reginald Butler. So I called up Reginald, and we met on the steps of the East Range, and I said, well, I found this document that looks like maybe there was a census of free black people in Virginia. He says, no, no such thing, no such thing. So Bob Clay worked at the archives then. Those of us that have been around a while, like Cinder, know well of Bob Clay, who could be a very irascible man, but knew the archives in and out. And he said he did not know of such a thing, but he would look for me, and he found it. Reginald and I drove to the Library of Virginia, and we met 2 of the women that I had dinner with in Richmond the year before, and they brought out 3 Hollinger boxes filled with manuscripts. It's like, where is all this stuff? And we're looking at, here's Albemarle, here's Pennsylvania, and Reginald's going, where's Goochland? Where's Goochland? Where's Goochland? And unfortunately, there were no records from Goochland. There was a letter from the clerk of court in Goochland saying that he knew of the attitudes of the free blacks in Goochland, and that none of them were interested in emigrating to Liberia. That's it. Send a letter, don't need a list. And with those were the letters from clerks all through Virginia, and in my essay, I excerpted or extracted the sort of the biting comments that these county clerks who knew the folks in their districts sent to the people in the Colonization Society who wanted to recruit free people of color to go to Liberia. And go to the book and read them. I can't begin to summarize them, but it's pretty amazing. So that is how Reginald and I became acquainted, but it was much more than a relationship over documents. In February rather, of 1997, my daughter was in 8th grade at Henley School, and they wanted to do a presentation or something like that for Black History Month. So I talked to the principal who I knew, and I said, well, maybe I can pull something together. And I talked to Reginald about it, and he said, yes, by all means, always pushing his students and pushing his colleagues to do things that were uncomfortable for them. But I gathered the documentation, the registrations, the apprenticeship indentures, and the other records that I had come across, and put together a talk to take to these young people. They, 8th grade is 13 or so. And we got out there, and all around the library room, they had posters for this event with the picture of Sojourner Truth on the poster. And I said, she was a slave. She wasn't a free person of color. And Reginald says, that's exactly why we have to be here. people don't know about free people of color, this is what we have to do to make them aware. And that is what Reginald was. Even with children this age, he was a teacher first and foremost. I had long discussions with him about race. My family's from Southside Virginia. You know I grew up in it. It helped me to understand a little bit about the way things were. For example, I had a great aunt that lived across from Green Street Park in Danville, Virginia. And one day I was outside playing tetherball with an African American child, and when I went inside, my great aunt says, you don't go on that side of the park. You have to stay on your side of the park. There's a black side of the park and a white side of the park. And I asked why. I must have been maybe 9 or 10 years old at the time, and she said, that's the way things are. And then on another occasion, I was out in Halifax County gathering tobacco to put in a tobacco barn with my aunts and uncles and cousins and the black people in the neighborhood that worked with them and with whom they shared the labor of bringing in tobacco. And at lunchtime, all the white people went to one place to eat and all the black people went to another place to eat. And I asked my aunts, why aren't they eating with us? And she just said, well, that's the way things are. And so there was never a real explanation for any of this. There was simply an acceptance. And I think that sort of mentality is the mentality that people of color carried throughout this colonial and early republic period that Reginald writes about. They may not have agreed with the laws. They went outside the law whenever they could, but there was an understanding of how things were and that they had to live within the bounds of how things were. So the real art here is to take a nebulous concept like that and to translate it into lived experience. And for me, that's what I think is so brilliant about Reginald's writing. He takes you into communities, but not just into communities, into the lives of people in a very intimate fashion. He meticulously constructed narratives. And when I was writing my section, I wanted to model this technique. I specifically sought, when I was talking about apprenticeship indentures, to find a story of a person that would create a narrative that would explain the context of what an apprenticeship indenture meant at that time to those people. And whether I achieved that, whether any of us can achieve an understanding of what things were like 200 years or more ago is beyond me to say what understanding is. It's for educated people like the gentleman around me to do that. So that's where we are. This hasn't stopped. It's continuing. I am, as you heard, I'm doing my best to put together materials that will help people explore these issues. Worthy Martin here, when I couldn't get funding from the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, kind of winked and said that, well, we can get your stuff up at IATH anyway. And what is now the Reginald Butler Local History Archive is some 65,000 images of documents from Albemarle, Louisa, Fluvanna, and Goochland counties. I don't have a front end for it yet. I'm going to steal from Scot's essay to build that. But, and it won't be indexed. People will have to browse it until OCR software comes along that can index text, which is on the way. And with the whole notion of OCR, I'll close on this point. Reginald lost his only digital copy of his dissertation around 2001 or 2002 when his Mac hard drive became a container of aluminum powder. And he gave me the paper copy of his manuscript and asked if I could OCR it and turn it into a digital file. And it took me a few years to do that. OCR software wasn't as smart then as it is now, although I'm not sure AI makes it all that much smarter, really. And on a page, he had his footnotes at the bottom. That all came out as text, some of it bold, some of it italicized. Everything had to be standardized. The footnotes had to be turned into footnotes instead of simply existing as free text. And I turned it into a Word document, got it back to Reginald. By the time I had completed his manuscript, he was already suffering from Parkinson's. And although we talked about it over the years, I guess he felt he was in no state of physical or mental health to continue. So it just sort of drifted until his death, and Peter picked it up and carried the ball. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I know so many of you. My association with the Institute goes back to about 1992. I was a graduate student in the Southern History program in the History Department, getting my PhD and working on my dissertation project, which was Nat Turner in American Memory. And I reached out to the Institute. I wanted to be affiliated in some way, and secured a GTA-ship with Adria LaViolette. I remember she was the instructor for 101, and that was my first formal connection to the Institute. So I TA'd 101, 102 several times, and then applied for a pre-doc fellowship and was a pre-doc fellow here from 92 to 94 with Armstead. And I was a fellow here when Armstead had his aneurysm, and experienced that moment when we didn't know really what was going on. It was things were kept very quiet, and then suddenly the news came that he had passed away, and it was a very traumatic moment for all of us affiliated with the Institute and the program. And behind the scenes, unknown to me, there was a search for who's going to take over, and a lot of concern about the future of the Institute. And the Institute at that time was not the big thriving fellowship program that Armstead had originally created. It was fairly small and underfunded. There were only 2 of us in my cohort. The question was, would the university continue to invest? And it would need a leader who could command that support. And the reason I now know the backstory to that is because of the Ford Foundation did a study in 2007, and they came in here and reported out on that moment. They created a history, which I only discovered in writing my piece for this. And they did interviews and reported how much concern there was and how they turned to Reginald and so that's sort of where I entered in was after Reginald had been here for a year or nearly a year, and I don't even remember sort of how it came to be. I knew Reginald in the history department. We talked about Nat Turner. He had written an encyclopedia article on Nat Turner, and I think he was a little skeptical of what I was doing because I was sort of looking at destabilizing the narrative and understanding how the narrative of Nat Turner emerged, but he enjoyed the conversation, and Armstead was very much into the topic as well. And so I had the great privilege of working with both and to understand the transition and then to see what Reginald's vision was for the Institute. And at some point, I think I don't remember, honestly, this is 1997, what is that, 30 years ago, right? And, you know, we worked together for 9 years and then another 4 after he really stepped down because we continued to work on projects together. We did the study abroad programs in Ghana and Brazil, all after he was director. So it was a long period, about 15 years of our collaboration. So it's hard to go back and recreate the beginnings of that relationship, but I can tell you, this research for the piece I did helped me to understand better how Reginald's vision for the Institute, how he came to this position with, I think, a fairly clear idea of what he wanted to accomplish. And so even though I had a lot of, because I worked with Reginald to write those grants, I knew it intimately, but there were things I didn't know. And I wanted to sort of distance myself a little bit from this narrative and bring Reginald's voice into it. Not my voice, but Reginald's voice as much as possible. And so one of the things I think Robert did a beautiful job of capturing the grants and the way in which each grant expanded the mission and was very carefully thought out in a fundamental rethinking of African and African American studies in the digital age, and from the local, regional, global, diasporic into the digital. Every grant expanding that, and that's what the essay does. But I want to highlight this moment of transition between when Reginald was a newly tenured faculty member in the history department, did not have to do this, and how he came to choose to do this. And as Josh asked me this, why do you think he did this? Because he said, why didn't he finish the book? He was doing this. Why did he choose to do this? And what was he doing instead of finishing the book, right? The essay is really trying to understand that. But the point clearly was, as Peter and as Robert said, he saw this position as a vehicle to achieve something great. And so how do I get at that question of why and what did he bring to this? It was in looking at the collaboration that Bob and Cinder had, and Armstead through the Foster Project, this Canada Foster Family Burial Ground. And that was where the Woodson Institute was when we got here. I forget the name of the road. Do you remember the name of the little...
Monroe Lane?
What was it?
Venable Lane.
Venable Lane.
Yeah, okay, that's it. It's the Venable Lane project. See, I should know that. But the key was to sort of recapture that, because Reginald always pointed to that as such an important part of the work that he did, that he valued so much this forum for exchanging ideas with people who are engaged in historical research but aren't in the academy, right? So Cinder's at Monticello and is a deep researcher, and Bob is doing this really deep research outside the academy, a lay scholar. We would have described you as a lay scholar, independent scholar, but Reginald said that model really was important to me, and I didn't know much about it until doing the research for this. I went back and looked at what happened when this discovery was made, and the chapter includes a pretty good chunk on that moment. And Armstead stepped forward and convened a kind of working group around that project, and Reginald was part of it. And so an entity called the Free Black Forum began to imagine where the research could take us on this project. And this is a fascinating, and because it ties in with Reginald's interest in free people of color, it's a liminal space here. It's on the edge of the, it's a space that is connected to the larger African-American community, the enslaved community. It's also connected to the university, and Kitty Foster is such an interesting figure, and then of course the descendants who pass into whiteness. Fascinating topic for research, and in the notes on that, which I think I got from Bob and others in emails it became clear that they had a vision for extensive research, publications, and really broadening out a kind of model for collaborative research, and including the digital, right? So all of that was sort of on, you know, in Reginald's mind, I think, when the moment came to decide, should he be someone who, and I had never had a conversation with him about that moment, but it seems to me that in thinking about this research project, he saw something that the Institute could play a role in that. And I think it's important that so did Armstead. Armstead had Millie Fife doing research. I know this because Gertrude asked me to help bring all that together around 2010. And so I was fascinated that already the Institute was kind of broadening out from the fellows program necessarily because there weren't many fellows and it couldn't. What was the Institute at the time? It was a fellowship program and it was the AAS, African and African American Studies curriculum. And was that enough to really sustain it? I think that both Armstead and Reginald were in some ways sort of in sync on this idea that, you know, this kind of community-based research could be really an important role for the Institute to play. And historically, the relationship between the university clearly and the surrounding communities was fraught. People would call with questions and nobody really had an interest in answering those questions. I like the fact that earlier there was a reference, you need to speak to Reginald Butler, and he answered, you know what I'm saying? So that was Reginald. Reginald would have answered, but really institutionally there was no place, no point of contact for the community who had a deep interest in these kinds of research projects, and also a real distrust about, you know, what the university would, what it meant to be collaborating with the university. Would the university be an equal partner in this, and would this be reciprocal, or would it be just sort of a colonial, you know, we're going to take your data, we're going to take your story. And I think all of that had to be sort of created, and I think that Reginald set out very early on to overcome that distrust, historical distrust, and to create structures that would incentivize collaboration with grants that would you know, bring funding to these projects, and also put them in digital archives where the material could be accessed. All of those race and place archives, that was the goal, to bring that information out and share it with everybody. You know, not just for his benefit, but for anyone interested in doing this, and giving credit to the community partners. And the fullest elaboration of that was the Center for the Study of Local Knowledge, which was, I think, a really successful you know, grant-funded project that would create seed funding for small teams of researchers, faculty, graduate students, community members, and so I won't go into all of this. It's all in the essay that I wrote, but I could see from that moment of the Foster site, Free Black Forum, and then merging into the sort of Central Virginia Social History Project, that Reginald saw the Institute doing this, not just locally, but then creating collaborations with the HBCUs, right? Bringing in underfunded faculty who are teaching heavy workloads, to bring them here in the summer, to rethink their syllabi, to introduce them to some of the digital resources, and then to offer funding in support of the work that they were doing. And then to sort of broaden that out to looking at our curriculum and ways in which Reginald also wanted to sort of broaden out the way students thought about African American studies. And I quote him on this in the article, but the idea was that everything ends in us here in this room. And he wanted them to be thinking about Brazil. He wanted to think about the diaspora. And he wanted to create experiences where we could fund students to go study Portuguese in Brazil. And so, you know, by the end, that was our final big project, was the three great study abroad programs, Cuba, Brazil, and Ghana. And the collaborations with community groups there, right? So we didn't just go in and do the standard tours. We worked with community organizations and community leaders to work on projects in each of those places. And the students who experienced that, and I was involved, very heavily involved in the Ghana program, but also went to Brazil and met with the community partners, the Steve Biko Institute, other. And the idea was that if you think of Reginald as being, super local and really an Americanist and really a Virginia, Goochland, you have to think it opposite. I mean, because he really saw that local global. And speaking to Kwame, who's here, last night, he said that was your perception of Reginald, very much a kind of, historian of this area. And I think that's what the article tries to suggest, is that as much as Goochland meant to him, and it was his home place, his travels, his world travels, and then all of the projects that he built would counter that he was a very worldly, his vision was global. He really wanted to get our students to open their minds and rethink their place in this diaspora. So I'm sorry I'm rambling on. It's a little emotional for me to be here and talk about this. The point of the article, though, I want to get to one key idea. How am I going to tell this story? I did want to sort of talk about administration. Thank you for raising the issue of academic administration, because that is actually the lead of the article. I saw a quote in Perspectives magazine, which is a historical, I think it's put out by the AHA, and it was an article by Peter Miller, and he's arguing for administration as argument by other means. And the idea was that you can have that kind of intellectual impact through academic administration. And I start with that quote. And I think that Reginald did that. I wanted to show the through line from his research through his work at the Institute as an expansion of that work, an extension of the work that he did on the manuscript. And to say this isn't just a postscript. This is fundamental to understanding him and his work. And it had never really been assembled in this way, right? We do all these projects, we do all these grants, and who's narrating that? It hadn't been. That story hadn't really been told. And I had grants, I had all of the grants, and it took me some work to tell that story. And and I'm in there too. It's an academic memoir, but I don't put myself in there as much as I can. I try to stay out. In fact, I'm very uncomfortable when I have to put myself into this, but to be honest about it, I'm interwoven into the story. But it felt really important for me to share it, because I don't know that other than Reginald and Gertrude, maybe, and some other people who are intimately involved in all of this, it would be very hard to see this whole. So I hope you'll read it, because I really think you'll understand Reginald and both his intellectual legacy and his institutional legacy. And I want to say that a lot of the things he started have been carried forward. The idea of the Center for the Study of Local Knowledge, there is one now at the Jefferson School. There's a Center for the Study of Local Knowledge there. The Halsinger Project, John Mason, thank you, John, for taking that to another level. That was a Reginald, original early VFH-funded project here in this space. The photographs displayed here in small form, not like the beautiful images that were displayed in the library. There are so many projects that were funded by the small seed grants that have gone on, students who did ESP who have gone on to PhDs and are leading figures in their fields, that Reginald's impact is just so much larger than you can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you for the valuable backstory, and thank you, Robert, for hosting this wonderful event. I feel a bit like an interloper. By training, I'm a modern historian of Europe, to go with the German accent, but I've made my living as an American history editor, and unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet Reginald. I started at UVA in September of 2019. But I knew Peter Onuf, and he's a valuable series editor for UVA Press. We have a series with him called Jeffersonian America. So when Peter emails me, I open that email right away. And We also have a decades-long association with the Woodson Institute for the book series with the Woodson. So when Peter emailed me, I was very intrigued. He emailed me I looked back through all 173 emails about this project in preparation for this, and Peter emailed me on a Friday, November 1st, 2019, with Reginald's with the manuscript and a framing for what he and his collaborators were going to do to bring it to fruition, telling me that Illinois had canceled the contract and he would very much like to place this book with Virginia. So on Monday, my very first email was to Deborah McDowell, who was then the director of the Woodson Institute and is a co-editor for the series. I'm going to be a little awkward. I'm going to quote myself here. Late last week, I received a somewhat unusual proposal from Peter Onuf, because it is unusual to receive a proposal for a book not from the author, but by a collaborator on somebody who's no longer alive. And then I was very gratified to read my former self as, personally, the components of the proposed book seem well thought out to me, and the project strikes me as potentially valuable asset to the early American and specifically colonial Virginia field for the research contained within the old study and for the new framing. Do you think that my sense is correct? So I was an early proponent of this book. I saw the value right away. And I was glad former self did that. And so then there's a lot of steps, however, involved in bringing academic books to fruition. And so after I queried Deborah right away whether this would make sense for the Woodson series, whether she's supportive of the project, I had to go to my colleagues in-house and say, we have this proposal. And it is somewhat unusual because the author is no longer alive. Fortunately, there was a good precedent. So we also published Armistead Robinson's magnum opus, Bitter Fruits of Bondage, in 2004. And there was enough institutional memory at UVA Press to see this as a similar kind of project. And we had the precedent also with the sales record. Because for publishers, the biggest questions about academic books are, is the idea new and novel? And peer review will reveal that. And can it sell? It can be the absolute best book, but if it's on a topic that only interests 5 people, even we cannot take it on. But with Armistead Robinson's sales record, we saw that it's possible to publish a really successful book after an author, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And we published a paperback of that book in 2024, so it's done really well for us. And because of the institutional memory and that record, which was also in the Woodson series, I was able to get immediate approval to talk to Peter on Zoom and say, yeah, we're interested. And so then what made me chuckle in my old correspondence, though, was you had given yourself a deadline of April 1st, 2020 to deliver the final manuscript. So I received the final manuscript on February 28th, 2023. There might have been a global pandemic in between. So it took a while for you all to pull it together. And then I was able to find 2 good readers. We always have to get books peer-reviewed by 2 outside readers. And I'm very, very glad that those 2 scholars got the assignment, because they didn't comment on what should be changed in the dissertation, which would have been impossible to do. But they commented on the framing pieces, and they also commented on audience, which is what our board of directors wants to see. And what's really interesting in these reports, they contradicted one another in interesting ways. One said, this is an oft-cited dissertation that needs to be made available to the broader public. The other reader said, this is a wonderful dissertation that's not cited enough, so it needs to be made available to the public. But all I needed to read is, it needs to be made available. Please publish.
Yep.
And the readers also agreed that the readership for this is potentially very wide, and I think these presentations have framed it that way as well. It's not just for scholars. It's also for public historians. It's for genealogists. It's for the descendant communities. So this is a book for wider audiences. And what the peer reviewers really asked you all to do is frame it a little differently so it has this wider audience appeal. So when I reread the reader reports, it was all about the framing. It was about making clear the connection between all your pieces and really celebrating Reginald and his accomplishments in a holistic way. And the other one was also about length. We all know people don't read anymore. There's students in the room, please continue reading long form. So one concern one reader raised was that some of the framing pieces were a little longer and they didn't want the framing pieces to overshadow Reginald's dissertation. So I think you didn't deliver on April 1st, 2020, but in February of 2023. But I received reports on this manuscript in July. You responded in August, you revised only that fall, and then the more critical reader signed off on it in December, which is lightning fast for academic publishing. So you had done a wonderful job leading up to submission, and then didn't have as much homework after. So, so it was a very quick process from submission for peer review to the final reader report that I shared with you in December of 23, I think. And then I was able to take it to our board in February of 2024. So about a year turnaround from submission to approval for contract and then copy editing. And the only thing we did in-house that I think where I also got involved was editing for length to make sure that Reginald's work was the main component of the book and the framing essays. And also one of the readers suggested you add a couple more voices to the book. So the testimonials from students at the end of the book, that's a direct outcome of the peer review process, which was really the peer review at work. And I think it's a fantastic manuscript, and then we were able to get it out in 2025 as a book. And it's another anecdote of Robert, when he asked me to be on this panel, asked me to speak with behind the scenes and anecdotes. One involves you. We were at an outside function, and I mentioned to you in passing at a lunch line, I think, that this book was in the works, and I've never seen your eyes get so big and so excited. You're usually very excited about the books in your series, but you were especially excited about this one. And so we had that conversation early in 24, I believe, and then I was able to tell the board that the now director of the Whitson Institute is fully in favor. And that also played really well with the board of directors, because it is a bit of an unusual project, as I already said, in terms of the author not being alive and able to respond to the peer reviews or be able to promote the book. And thank you so much for making this happen, to promote the book and celebrate it. So even though usually when an editor gets a manuscript from somebody who's no longer alive, we have hesitations. There were no hesitations on UVA Press's part. It made sense for the series, it made sense institutionally, the peer reviewers signed off on it. It's a fantastic piece of scholarship that will now hopefully be cited a lot by the next generations of scholars, and be a testament to Reginald's work, and then allow his legacy to live on. So in terms of UVA Press and the institutional backstory, it was nothing but green check marks, no red flags. So thank you for bringing it to us.
More than a half hour for conversation, and so it's just open for anyone to share thoughts, ideas, feedback, whatever it is, but it's just a free-flowing conversation that can happen. I don't think I need to stand up and moderate anything. Just feel free to jump in and we can just go in an interactive way. Yes? Okay.
It's like being in class. I'll just add on to Bob's story. I'm a former student of Reginald, and I'd probably say this fashion. And I student taught at Buford Middle, and I wanted the kids to meet Dr. Butler, and he came in and he presented, I don't know if it was the Holzinger photographs, but it was pictures and history. You'd probably know Scott, but it was great seeing him present to challenging audience, middle schoolers are tough. But he took his time to go present to the kids in Charlottesville. So I just love that he also helped you out our school. So it just says a lot about just how he cares about people. You might not know them, but community. So.
My name is Brandy Watford. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. I just want to thank you all very, very much for publishing this book. I read the book, I skimmed through it and was in the index, looking through it, and it's amazing. My mother was born in Goochland. Her whole maternal family was born in Goochland. They were some fascinating people that I got to meet before they started deceasing. But that book is amazing. The manuscript is amazing. Talks about the community and the businesses they created for themselves and how they survived. I think just watching them surviving for the most part was hard, just strengthening to us as children and to the families that they were raising, and how they were networked with each other. They were very, very tight. I know you may have heard of Neely Town, which was on Dugtown Road. So that was mostly Amanda Mealy descendants. They called her Amanda Mealy. And that was mostly a lot of her descendants. And then there was the Mealy family that lived on Sandy Hook Road, which is where my mom and my grandma was born. And this place called Licking Hole District, Goochland County, Virginia. That basically our whole family grew up knowing no matter where they went throughout the United States. You go back and you look at Licking Hole District, Goochland County, Virginia. So to see this piece of work come out, it's just amazing. And you just don't know how much you've done for us as we research our family and we get to know them in ways that we never were able to get to know them. And just want you to know how grateful we are. We have a cousin that is a genealogist, Oris, that we've met, we have connected, and it's pieces of like work like this, books, manuscripts that actually have brought us together and even found family that is located in other parts of the country. So you can pat yourselves on the back, definitely.
I want to add, Brandy was the chair of the Mealy family reunion last year that we held at Central High School in Goochland County, Virginia. And so she is also a huge part of bringing our families together. I spent a lot of time in the Goochland County Courthouse myself, so reading this book is very emotional for me as well. 30-something years later, I wish I could have met Dr. Butler, but every day I Google Goochland County, Virginia, free Black people, and one day this book came up. So I'm so grateful. I'll repeat everything Brandy said. Crybaby, but that's okay because it's real. It's real emotion. This is over 300 years of our family here. I only have 2 ancestors in this book, but Brandy probably has about 10 ancestors in this book. So I'll repeat everything that Brandy just said, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
And I say one more thing. Please make sure that Louisa County Historical Society and Goochland County Historical Society copy. If you can, if you can't, I will get them a copy because they have literally helped us connecting one another. And whenever somebody calls them and says Goochland County or Louisa County and says like, I have ancestors that were from there, they always give them something to go off of. And it helps them find their family.
My name is Kimberly Mealy, and I'm also a part of the Mealy family. Brandy and Aris, it's nice to see you. I just wanted to thank the panel, Dr. Onuf, for making sure that this book could be published and shared with the public, making sure that Dr. Butler's vision could be shared more broadly and globally. When you're speaking about his global interest as well, I'll just share that our family is also a global family. Some of the Mealy descendants now live in New Zealand. That is my sister, Monica. and I've sent her the book. So your book is in New Zealand. Bird dog here highlighted, and our family is very interested in continuing with the genealogical search as well. I'm a descendant of James Mealy and Francis Scot, and have just found, great joy in being able to research our family, but also understanding that, cousin Reggie was so forward thinking and so ahead of his time in the research that he was able to do, the vision that he had, his determination, his brilliance, and making sure that he could put that to very important work so that we could better understand community that was understudied, underserved, and often, marginalized. And so I want to thank you for bringing his work to us, and making sure that it can live again. So thank you.
I'd like to volunteer something, please. One of the projects that I didn't mention was something that Steve Thompson, who's here, and I did. We photographed 1937 aerial photos of Albemarle County that delineate land ownership. This was one of the first cadastral maps of the entire county that I know of. And the map is interesting because parcels are numbered on the front, and on the back, the names are listed next to the number. And if people were black, still COL parentheses. And with these data, I was able to use ArcGIS to create an online map that showed land ownership for the Rivanna district by race. And you could use a Boolean query and could say, for example, race is equal to black and acres is more than 50. And it would highlight those parcels that corresponded to that query. Now, since then, that site that I put up is down. Eric Ertenkopf has moved everything into ArcGIS Online. It covers the entire county now. It has multiple layers of information, and this, along with, let's say, the Butler archive, is a major source of information, historical information for Albemarle County. And if you all haven't seen it, take a look, see what you think.
So that site is Hidden Histories, right?
That
Contours.
Shaded contours.
Shaded contours. So that's the way you find it online.
Yeah, the URL for it is actually in the book. So.
My name is Brian Foster. I'm in sociology. Always grateful to be in the space. I've been at UVA for about 5 years, and I really appreciate the community that is so clear in and around Woodson and Minor Hall. I hear it in the exchange. So just saying, appreciate that. I teach a Black community life course, and have been eager for something to teach that centers Virginia. I know that there is work out there for them. Really looking forward to teaching this one, and wondered just if y'all have perspective on, beyond just engaging with the book. I appreciate the the kind of reference to the map. If y'all have ideas or recommendations for how y'all might like students to engage with the work, in particular the book, but y'all have talked about all of the archival and so forth efforts that went into it. Happy to, and I plan to reach out separately, but just wondered if y'all have kind of top of mind ideas for how y'all would like to see students engaging with the project.
That makes the class.
20.
Okay. So I don't know how I would do this today. Scott and I were talking a little bit about this. So one of the things I did, I don't even remember if it was related directly to race and place, but I taught, after I sort of spent some time in the archives, I taught a digital history. I think it was digital history in the Jim Crow South. It's still out there. One of the amazing things about early HTML, Ed can probably tell us a lot about this too. Early HTML was real basic, but it was also real stable. I still get emails. I got one like 6 months ago. Somebody sent me an email asking if I was the person who wrote that essay on sources. And they were like, "Oh, such a great resource. How did you even find this thing?" And I dug around. If you Google like race and place, you can still get to it. But the point is that, you know, when I sort of had all these students, and in the 90s, it was partially about teaching them sort of HTML basics, but partially about like digging into these archives and sort of building their own kinds of projects. So I think one way to teach this is, you know, it doesn't have to be sort of like 19th century historical research, right? You're talking about Black communities broadly. This is sort of a historical example, but this is sort of what it looks like to do a deep dive and produce something in text and prose. But there are lots of ways to manifest that, right? How you would do it now, I mean, you know, I'm very loath to turn people loose on generative AI, but it can do some things with source materials, right? I've seen at least very prototypey stuff that can read 19th century documents, right? And do OCR of 19th century cursive. My students can't read that. They need a freaking Paleolithic to read it. No joke. Because most of them don't like cursive, right? So they look at it, it's like scribbling, it's like hieroglyphics. But being able to sort of turn certain student groups to design their own projects, whether that's digital, whether it's you know, whether it's a traditional kind of historical essay, whether it's museum exhibits, you know, send them to the courthouse. See what they can do if they get into these materials and sort of look at what Reginald did and maybe some of the framing stuff and say, you know, there's some exciting possibilities here, ways to kind of excavate ideas about Black communities, whether in the past or now. That's kind of the direction that I would sort of steer in if I were teaching it.
Let me put a caveat in.
I'm not saying go loose with generative AI.
No. This is, if you go to the Albemarle Courthouse, there's nothing there anymore.
Where's it all? Is it all?
It's all archived.
Oh, that's a shame.
No deed books, no will books. It's all
That's too
archived.
bad.
What you need to do is to sign up for a free account on ancestry.com or not search. Family search.
Yeah, it's all in there.
And
it's not the same experience, but the outcome could be similar.
And one of the things that Alice was mentioning, the CV Central Virginia Historic Researchers site, I have a URL that I put in there for resources, and it has long listings of different source books, deeds, the deed books, the will books by like deed book 43, deed book 44, and the exact URL that will take you to that place on Family Search, because navigating the Family Search interface is a nuisance. But that's really where the documentation is, that, and of course the Library of Virginia with their Virginia Untold is incredible, and more stuff is going up there. They're doing a fantastic job. But that's not to say that everything is out there. There are some key sources like apprenticeship indentures, which are a key source for Black history. They are only online for certain counties where they've gone into the manuscripts and have dug them out and then had the funds to have them photographed, photocopied. So it's an ongoing, but more and more things will be online.
And it doesn't have to be, you know, go look at all the deed books. Like you're talking about the map that you put together, right? Or the Free Black Registry, right, that exists. You can start with a single document and make something really expansive. I mean, that's one of the lessons that Scott was saying, right? It looks small, but the implications of it can be so much bigger. And students can get their heads around that, right? You don't want to turn, you know, some sophomore loose, expect them to write a dissertation, but they don't have to write a dissertation, do something meaningful.
I'm at Ayers. I came here the same year as Armstead in 1980, and I chaired the committee that hired Reginald as a professor in the history department. So I will make those claims. But I want to call people's attention to the enduring consequence of the work on the Kitty Foster family. And talk about administrative work. Mel Leffler and I worked together when we were deans to build some space in the parking lot that where the Foster family was. You go there today, you'll see a ghost house, a frame accurately placed over where the home was, and an evocation of the burial sites that are there. And so when the university wanted to expand there, built upon the incredible work that had been done here for a long time with ground penetrating radar and all this to make sure that we didn't desecrate further this site. But now there's interpretive panels that explain all about all this, so that it's embodied in this work of scholarship, but it's also embodied in the physical place that generations of EVA students might never think about the history beyond the grounds. You can see right there that there was a family staying for generations, an identity that the university had not honored in their lifetimes, but has tried to do since. So that's a very concrete consequence of the work that Reginald and Woodson did, and that a lot of you folks were involved in as well. So if you don't know the university, it's worth visiting this site on the South Lawn to see how that legacy of Reginald's work.
I just want to add, if anybody is really interested in those deed books, the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society now has them and has preserved them. So they are in the basement, but the librarian can get them for you. You don't just have to look at them in digital form. Little plug. Super. Yeah.
Yes, hello. My name is Catherine Jenkins-Jones. I'm a community member that does work in education and restorative justice education at the high school level here in Charlottesville. I don't have an institutional connection to UVA, except I'm very grateful to have attended several of Woodson's events over the years. Very grateful for learning more about Mr. Butler and really honored to be here with members of the Neely family. I have a question and a comment. My question is about the intellectual and consciousness of the intellectual sort of zeitgeist or in consciousness of the communities that Dr. Butler was studying. And I think I'm particularly interested, y'all touched on this idea of internationalism and a sort of like a Pan-African consciousness in terms of Butler's work institutionally and connecting to Ghana and Cuba and Brazil. And I was wondering if that consciousness, if in his work, if you found that over the generations anywhere in communities in Goochland. And I think in terms of my specific interest, I'm wondering especially about the influence of Haiti and Haiti's independence so early. And, I'm aware of some scholarship of Haitians, the Haitian government in the early years of independence sponsoring African Americans to migrate there. I know you said that the Goochland clerks said that they were not interested in going to Liberia, but just wondering about sort of internationalism and African consciousness, if that was there. And then my comment is just that I'm always looking for ways to connect the students that I work with a sort of sense of legacy of resistance. So I welcome any suggestions for that later if we have time.
I mean, you're talking about sort of the consciousness in the time of the study of the period of Reginald's.
Yeah, the community that he's studied.
Well, you said nothing good.
Oh man! All right, I had a feeling you can do that.
This is an elusive topic.
It is an elusive topic. Trying to get at that consciousness for people who were not allowed to leave a lot of written records behind. Sometimes because of literacy issues, not as often as you would imagine. Their perspectives were not considered valuable enough to archive. Right? We know that the archive is sort of slanted in lots of very particular ways to sort of replicate the power structure of the time. So getting at kind of the specificities of what you might see among people in Goochland, I suspect that there was a lot more in Reginald's notes, things he came across in the course of his research that we have no access to anymore, right? And so that theme doesn't emerge really prominently in the book, but I'd be surprised if it's not in there somewhere. Now, having said that, we know broadly that the example of the Haitian Revolution continued to influence generations of people of African descent in the United States. The thing that jumps to mind for this period in particular is sort of the Vesey conspiracy in South Carolina, right? Lots of things inspired Denmark Vesey and people who were involved in that plan. But the idea supposedly was that once all these people were going to escape, revolt, and they were going to leave, they were going to get on a boat. They were going to go to the Caribbean, right? Because Vesey was himself, when he was enslaved by a ship captain, right? So he had a kind of larger sense of this kind of Atlantic world that he was embedded in, and that existed sort of across the sort of diaspora in the United States. What I would have really been interested to see, and then I wonder what Reginald would have done with, this book ends at Nat Turner. And I always wanted to, that was one thing of all the things that were sort of embedded in this book that I really would have liked to see him deal with this. Because the impact of the Turner insurrection, revolt, uprising on enslaved people throughout the United States, especially in Virginia, is profound, right? The legal regime snaps into place in all kinds of new ways. And I would have really been interested to see, both at the front end, sort of what are the kinds of ideas that he imagined or could see circulating in communities in Goochland, and then sort of what is the impact on those communities in the aftermath. I don't know, but I would have loved to see it.
I think maybe one place to look would be the Colonization Society, the 1833 survey that I mentioned earlier. That was as a result of Nat Turner. And then for Fluvanna County, you have the book Dear Master, Letters to John Hartwell Cobb from his emancipated people that he sent to Liberia. And that may well give you some insight into what people were thinking and feeling in the midst of all of this.
I'd just like to say that, in a way, it is elusive. We can't presume to know, but I strongly recommend common sense. I think that's the implication of what Josh was saying. Don't condescend to your sources. Don't project onto them. They're not you. They don't think about the world the way you do. But there's a common ground. We can understand the past. There are simple questions to ask. You can provide the answer. Too much of Black history, African history, has been erased because of the scrupulosity and not presuming to say anything. I strongly recommend my good friend Annette Gordon Reed's book about the Hemmingses of Monticello, which
what was the author?
Annette Reed.
Oh, yes.
In which functions for me on two levels. She's constantly posing questions, or implicit in the text, of what would you do? What would you say? Given the constraints that you understand, she's presented to you about what can be done and said. I also think, just coincidentally, I know I'm too Jefferson obsessed, but it is a brilliant biography of Jefferson by other means. There's so much that can be done with those fragments, with those things that seem, and I thought that was wonderful you made that point, Josh. Don't become a literary scholar in a new historicist mode where you overdo it, but take what you got and think like a human being.
I'm just going to jump in on the Nat Turner moment because it was a great search afterward for trying to understand that revolutionary consciousness and the source of it, right? The outside agitators, they looked to David Walker's appeal, circulation of a liberator. They had the governor collect data on incidents in counties all through that part of Virginia. And I never thought to look for Goochland. You know, Reginald would have looked for Goochland first, but you know, you could map the influence of that event into Albemarle and well beyond. And they would talk about, you know, someone having been brought by their master from, you know, the West Indies, and having that be a kind of source of infection, right? And there was a lot of effort to sort of also stop transportation out of state into the free states of into states outside of Virginia. Virginia was trying to send them away, but these other states were putting up rules saying, don't send them here because they're going to bring with them. They have that, they've witnessed this, and they will bring it with them. So I think we can understand in that moment, maybe find some references to particularly Goochland, I'm not sure, but that's a moment when all that conversation around that really gets documented.
I may add one thing, and that is, it reminds me of the significance of the race and place. Since for some communities, you do not have the traditional archive, sometimes answers are embedded in places. So I think of, for instance, Faro, Texas, where there's Olivia Street, where you grew up. Yeah, it is recorded. Sometimes parents named their children in honor of Toussaint. Yeah, because the Haitian Revolution frightened planters tremendously, especially because they were sailors and in port cities, you know, there was this interaction. So there are all these indirect ways in which you can recover some of these histories that were suppressed. It's embedded in the land, which was one of the important things about this race and place initiative of
Hi, I'm Kiara Price, a proud Petersburg girl, but also a current fellow at the Woodson Institute. And Dr. Rothman in particular, in your opening for the book, you give us some places that you think Dr. Butler could have developed his research. And one of those is his discussion of women within the community. But then once I get into his introduction, his preface, he starts it with the cases of two women, two presumed mothers, we'll say they were, that committed infanticide. He goes on to kind of say, within this Black community, women were at the center. And so what do you think, all of you, as you're editing it, as you were a colleague of his, was his purpose of starting with them, and then how it developed throughout the rest of the dissertation, because you still felt that, you know, it was a place he could have.
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? And I didn't mean to imply that he was sort of neglectful of it. It just felt like I felt like with the way he wrote the book, there were a lot, you know, I've talked about it more in terms of kind of where historiography has gone since then. And ideas about not women per se, but ideas of thinking about gender and its relationship to race felt sort of underdeveloped. And those were directions that I think scholars have gone in since he was writing. But that's a really sort of intriguing point, right? Obviously was not unaware of the significance of women to these communities. I think I was thinking more about free Black communities and gender roles in particular. And he wouldn't have been thinking about them in ways that I think he would have thought about them if he were writing the book, you know, not even just now, but, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So when I can't remember what other themes, I think there were a couple themes in there that I was like, you know, if he was writing this today, here are things I think the seeds of it are there that I would have liked. I think he could have developed a lot more. But that thinking of that opening anecdote, I think was really important to him.
Very
right?
provocative.
It's extremely provocative, and I think it's some of the best writing in the book, actually. And I don't know if that's because he worked it over more than the others, but I don't think it was just that. There was something in those incidents that he felt really contained enough. There's a reason he started the book.
respect to women, your work with the West family, don't you focus on that to a degree?
Yeah, but I mean, even so, one of the first things I ever did as a graduate student that became my dissertation was a study of the Isaacs West family, which was a sort of a free Black woman and a Jewish man, and they sort of built this family together downtown in Charlottesville. And you know, but even like I wasn't really thinking in those terms. That essay is not really focused on gender in any systematic way, and it could have been. Some of it I think reflected kind of my own interest where I was coming from. Some of it reflected the fact that I wrote it in 1996, right? And so I think about the literature that people like 1996 people were still using Free Women of Petersburg, right? That was sort of like the seminal book, but even that book was already almost 15 years old by that point. And there was so much more that came after than came before. So if I were writing that essay now, I mean, it would be completely different than what it had been.
All right, I think this is a great place to end. Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing. Give testimony and shared, added more, and shared the impact of the book. And this book clearly will have a wide impact locally from Virginia to New Zealand and beyond. Please, let's just share. Everyone has a program? Yes. If you don't, there are time, but just follow the program. We're here most of the day. We're having lunch now in the lobby. And the second panel, which talks about Reginald Butler, his institution builder, that panel will be in Warner 109, just right next door, the building right next door. And we're moving there because of the classes here at that time. And then after that panel, we come back here for the rest of the day. All right? So for now, let's have fun and let's get it out.